Sweet, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Yarelix. I use she, her pronouns. I work at the New York City Department of Health and I run the drug checking program in New York City. I'm going to share a presentation that's really long, but I'm probably going to do like more of an overview kind of thing and touch over some topics that, if they're of interest, then we can have a conversation about, because I know there's a lot of different discussions that we can have about drug checking and the drug supply. So I want to leave some time for, for dialogue and questions and things like that. But also, while I'm presenting, if you have any questions or like anything that you want clarified, like feel free to unmute yourself and say something or put it in the chat, and I'm happy to pause and answer as I'm going along. But thanks for being here. It's nice to share this info with other folks. Okay, so this is the presentation. Just for context, getting this started was not super easy to convince this government to buy us machines to test drugs. But of course, when we framed it, it was framing around fentanyl, framing around the overdose deaths that have happened in the city. And so, it's hard for City Hall to turn down a preventative measure that we currently don't have for the city. Um, and that was kind of how we got our foot in. The initial proposal that I put in was in 2020, which was when at that time we saw like an overdose spike in the data that was similar to the spike that we saw when fentanyl first entered the supply. Unfortunately, that spike has continued to increase. Last year we had 2,668 overdose deaths, and the numbers have just continued to rise. Like every new quarter is the worst quarter than we've seen than the last quarter, which is really sad. But the reason why we have drug checking, as y'all can imagine, is because we don't know what's in the supply. Not only because of fentanyl, we know that fentanyl is driving overdoses, but we don't have an idea of what other adulterants are in there, and a lot of folks don't know what they're using. And so to be able to provide that in real time for participants and also in a larger scale to programs is something that's really helpful, just to get a sense of what people are consuming and what we can do to support them. So the machine is called the FTIR. It's a Bruker Alpha Fourier Transform Infrared Spectrometer. It's a mouthful. And basically, it allows for us to know the active ingredients, so like heroin, fentanyl, MDMA, etc. Also contaminants like xylazine, levamisole, phenacetin. Also inactive fillers, which is kind of a benefit to the machine that some other machines don't have. So you can tell if there's like toothpaste or Imodium or boric acid or mannitol or baking soda, like these other kind of like not psychoactive substances. And depending on the sample, we can do an approximate amount of the ingredients compared to other ingredients. And this allows for people to know what's in their supply, and in some circumstances, figure out ways to use it in a way that reduces their risk. And it also gives us the opportunity to monitor local trends in the drug supply. Like, definitely as we were rolling this out, we were like, what? Okay. Which has been in some situations not super helpful, because it's just like, what does this mean? Why is this in here? In other situations, it's been helpful to like get ahead of certain ways that people can be aware of how they can reduce the risk with certain substances. So basically, the machine uses infrared light to be able to see what is in a particular drug. It's kind of like a drug has a fingerprint, and then that comes out on a machine, like on the screen like this. And the cool thing about the machine using infrared light is that it's non-destructive. So people can bring their drugs and they can test them, and they don't get destroyed. So we test it and then give it back to them. And the substances, the machine is able to test for a wide variety of compounds, and the way that it's able to do that is through a library that the software has. And so it's able to come in and then compare what is in the substance with the library of drugs. Another benefit is that it requires minimal sample preparation. So the machine can only test powders and pills, and that's because it has a 5% detection limit, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But it can also test GHB and GVL, because that's something that is like not diluted down under 5%. And so if somebody were to bring like crack or meth, all I have to do is crush it up and it's able to be tested. And it's able to produce results in a few minutes. But the main ones that we use, unfortunately, the pharma libraries are necessary to get, and the pharma libraries are libraries that provide like the inactive substances, so like weird fillers and contaminants that people might put in there. But we primarily use that one. We also purchased one called Tic Tac, which like Tic Tac is not really necessary to use anyway. So if you're with a program that might be tight in funds, I wouldn't recommend buying it. But if you have like just expendable funds, and it's like why not? Like having an extra library doesn't hurt. But the two libraries that we actually primarily use are the BCCSU libraries. Yeah, not TikTok. um, and BCCSU is a British Columbia Center on Substance Use, and they have a ton of resources. Like most of what I've learned is from them. Like they have like, and it's a lot of like community resources. But BCCSU and Swig Drug, they are two open source libraries, and so they're free. They're downloadable from online or from a mailing list. So those are definitely the two that we lean on the most, along with the pharma libraries. I never use the Georgia Crime Lab library. They have these weird like mixtures that are useless because we don't know what our mixtures are. So it's like, yeah. And then of course we use immunoassay test strips, so fentanyl test strips, and benzodiazepine test strips. And our program is actually piloting xylazine test strips, which has been really interesting and also really scary to see actually like a huge discrepancy between the number of samples that we're not testing positive for having xylazine, but are testing positive on the strip just because of the 5% detection limit. So again, I'll go into this with more detail, but the machine has a 5% detection limit, meaning if I get like a little bit of a sample and I put it on the machine and there is a substance present in under 5%, then the machine will not reliably pick it up. And for that reason, we always use fentanyl test strips, benzodiazepine test strips, and now xylazine test strips because they're able to test below that detection limit. Um, so it's definitely like at one point we were like, yeah, there's like 10% xylazine at this site, but now that we have the xylazine test strips, it's looking more like 30 to 40%, which is really concerning and something that we're kind of like working through, parsing through the data now that we have this like higher level of specificity. But unfortunately, it's it only produces a yes no result. So like it's helpful to know, but also like depending on the person's tolerance and like what substance they're using and if they're using it intentionally or not, it provides a limited amount of information to the participant. And then we use confirmatory testing, and so this is a really like extremely important component of drug checking, just because like the machine is great, but there's two things that can go wrong: either the machine misses the drug, or because it's under the detection limit, or the technician misses it. It's always a possibility if it's a new technician, or there's just weird quirks that the machine has that like leads to some signals covering up other substances. Um, and like so for example, like something that happens a lot in Chicago, they have a class of drugs called nitazines, which somebody put in the chat like a question about iso. And like it's a class of synthetic opioids that can be up to 20 times stronger. Some people theorize higher, but up to 20 times stronger than fentanyl. And so it's very, very strong. It leads to an extremely high tolerance. Obviously, it causes a really high risk for overdose. Um, but it's so strong that it would be present in under 5%. And so the machine would not pick that up. And there are no nitazine test strips. And so for that reason, like the only way that we would really know that it's in the supply is if we're able to send those samples to a lab, and then that lab can test it and definitively tell us if there's anything else in there. And it's unfortunately it's expensive. Like we pay $157 per sample. If we want a higher degree of precision of information, we pay 200 per sample. But like it's extremely important. I'll give a quick example. Like, so let's say that somebody comes in, they had a really heavy nod. They're just like, holy shit, this was strong as fuck. We test it on the machine and it doesn't test positive for anything except like an inactive substance. And then you test it with a fentanyl test strip. So depending on the technician and the technician's like not intelligence, but just like awareness of the supply and like constantly searching what's going on and reading trends in other places, the technician can say, oh, this isn't testing positive for fentanyl, it must be heroin. Or the technician might say, this isn't testing positive for fentanyl, it might be some other stronger, synthetic opioid. We should send it out for confirmatory testing. You should probably avoid using it. But imagine someone's like, oh, it's heroin, cool, I'm going to use more. And then they're going to die for sure because of how strong it is. And so it's like the messaging that can happen when we don't have the information is really, it has really high risks. And for that, it's really important to send it out for confirmatory testing. And really, before we had the xylazine test strips, this was the only way that we knew that there were small amounts of xylazine in the supply because of that, detection limit that the machine has. So as I mentioned, like this, the confirmatory testing is super important because it's able to tell us what's in the supply below 5%. It's also able to tell us analogs. So, for example, there are certain kinds of fentanyl analogs that we can detect, but like for example, carfentanil, right? Carfentanil is like up to 100 times stronger than fentanyl. Fortunately, we haven't seen it in New York City as of yet, but it's in Toronto, so like it's not super far away. Like it wouldn't surprise me if it eventually made it over, and that could have catastrophic effects. But unfortunately, because of the way that the molecular like structure of carfentanil is, like it's not detected by fentanyl test strips. Um, and it's if it's present in the supply, it's probably present in under 5%. So it's something that we would potentially miss, which sucks. Yeah. Um, and I'll talk a bit more about this in more detail, but when we do our training phase, because we really wanted to just like make sure that people were trained properly and knew when to use discernment of like, I don't know what the fuck this is, let me send it off and give as much information as possible to the participant. When someone is in training, we send off every single sample for confirmatory testing. And then once we're not no longer in training, then we send off every 10th sample or any sample that caused an unusual effect or any sample that can't, or someone who had an overdose, or any sample that could not be identified on the FTIR. So there's some things that I look at that I'm just like, what the fuck? So I communicate what I see and what I understand, but also tell the participant like there's something in there that I couldn't identify, um, and then also basing it off their experience, like have you used any of this? How much did you use? What like how did you feel about it? Because if they didn't really experience anything, it could just be like a random filler that the library might not have, but because we don't have that information, we don't want to be overconfident and like put someone in danger potentially. So this is what I was talking about earlier. The FTIR, again, it's great. It's like one of the best understood tools that we currently have in harm reduction because they've been using it in Canada for like over 10 or 20 years, and then in Europe over 20 years as well, I think. So the things that it is able to do is use a huge library to identify a wide variety of substances. BCCSU, that provides one of the open source libraries, is like constantly looking for new substances and then updating and emailing it out to people. So they're doing that work of like checking for new things. Um, the other thing that it's helpful is that it can provide the major components in a sample, which like in confirmatory testing, they can't tell us inactive substances. So it's cool that like the FTIR can provide that complementary information and it can give a rough idea of quantification. So it's not perfect because of that 5% detection limit. And also it's not a super sensitive machine, but it provides us like a good amount of information. Um, but what the FTIR can't do is that it can't provide us, the information of what might be happening and under that 5% detection limit. It can't provide under actual quantification for that same reason. It's not able to reliably detect or provide full range of analogs. And I put fentanyl here specifically because oftentimes when I'm like presenting, it's to folks that are so fentanyl focused, but really it can't detect analogs across different drugs. So like I've been able to test drugs from the 2C family like all right because it tends to have like a higher amount of it, but sometimes like when you're looking at the list it'll be like this could be 2CB, 2CI, 2C, and so it takes a bit of manipulation to be able to try to figure out which one it is, but also like the dosing between different substances in the 2C family are really different, and the ways in which it like interacts with the person in their body is really different, so that can also be a potential limitation if somebody brings something that's like a very small amount, um, because at smaller amounts it's harder to detect differences between analogs. And yeah, and lastly, like the machine, it's like a plus and a minus. The machine is cool because it's non-destructive, so like you bring the sample, you put it in, and the person can get their results back, except whatever's used for the test strips. But it's still just a small part of the substance, right? And so like if someone who sells drugs brings me like a kilo of their drugs and I test this much, I can't say that this small bit is representative of like their whole kilo. And so what I usually do is if somebody is like really wants to get an idea of what's going on with their supply and I have time, like nobody's waiting outside or anything, we'll like test different parts of the bag just to see if it's consistent across those bags. But again, this is like time intensive and oftentimes they do have a line that's going out the door. And so it's, we just have to say like, this is not representative of the entire supply. And if you want to like, have time to do this, then they have to come back when things are not as busy. So I'm not going to go into this. This is kind of like a bit of an advocacy point, but just to say that I want drug users to do drug checking work. That's all. And then I'll touch briefly on this as well. Time intensive. So time intensive just means that like a regular sample when I test can be like 10 minutes at most. But if they want me to check, and because I'm checking just like one small amount, but if I'm checking like six different parts of the bag, that can be like an hour. So it just depends on how much. Like I've had people that are like, I'm about to give this Coke bag to my brother, and I'm just like really fucking paranoid. Please check it 6 times, and I'm like, okay. And I'll be with them for like an hour or 2 hours if I have time to do that. Other times I'll have to cut it short. But it really like I don't set time limits on anyone who comes in. It's more of like someone's coming. I'm sorry, like I gotta make time for someone else. But if there's time, I definitely like will hang with whoever. So this is the training plan that we have in the city. I actually need to update this, but this is by no means like correct. I spend a year with my technician, so it's kind of hard to. Yeah, I'll answer that in a sec. So the first thing that we usually do with training is I give whoever I'm training like a ton of literature. There's so many things that exist already. Like there's handbooks and there's like guides and there's like manuals and all these things. A lot of them from VCCSU, a lot of them from Victoria Substance in Canada. Like Canadians are doing like really rad stuff. And have people read up on that. There's also a like a drug checking training program offered through the BCCSU that's free, and it has like online modules. So I'll have people do that as well. And then after that, again, ignore the hours because it's just like a random number that we put up there. But I usually have people come and like learn how to use the machine and the software because the software is a bit complicated. Um, and then once people have a sense of like the general functionings of the machine, then I'll give them scans. And so the scans will be just like, you go home and it's like solving a puzzle, right? You're trying to figure out what's in it, and then I have the answer key, and then like we review it together. And then once we have done that, then we'll go ahead and work with actual drugs. The last piece is the last two pieces is shadowing. So I'll bring my technician with me. They'll sit with me. They'll watch me kind of go through everything, because it's one thing to do drug checking in a controlled environment, like a quiet office that no one's bothering you. It's different to be in the overdose prevention center or in the harm reduction program where there's like people fighting outside and three people yelling at you and telling you to hurry up and all of these things. And so they shadow me just to get a sense of the environment and how to communicate results once we get those results. And then the last piece of that is letting them, do their thing. And I'll explain that specific part in a little bit as well. But I put 20 hours here. I think we've been talking between like 20 to 30 hours. Realistically, my technicians have been like, I'd say it's like a 6 month kind of like ongoing training thing. And of course, like a lot of the people that are in my team are also, we only have two other people, but they're also doing other work besides just drug checking. So it's, but the hourly thing is kind of hard to time out. So how busy am I? I'd say, so this is really dependent on like the utilization over time or like the rollout, I guess. I'd say in the beginning when I would open a new site, I would see maybe like 4 people a week per site, like per 4 people per session, basically. Now that things have been ongoing for some time, like it's been over a year. I started November of 2021. Um, on busy days, I can see anywhere between like 10 to 16 people. And so it just depends on, some people really need a lot of support, like they're going through a lot emotionally, and so I try to make space for that. Um, and sometimes that's like a waiting time for other people. And I try to be as flexible as possible too, so people can like drop off their samples, go do their thing, and then come get the results, or I'll call them and things like that. Leave the samples with the staff. Um, so yeah, anywhere between like 10 to 16, I'd say. Like the overdose prevention center is really busy, as you can imagine. We have a lot of samples that come out of the OPC. And so I have samples that are just like waiting for me when I arrive, and while I'm checking those, I'm also checking people who are getting their things checked in real time.
In Yarelix, how many are qualified to do this service?
Like as technicians.
Yeah, like besides yourself.
So my other colleague is currently finishing his training phase, which I'll talk. I'll just go on to this right now. But technically, he's going to be coming out of his training phase, which is like he is officially like a full graduated whatever technician. And then we have one colleague who's coming on to her training phase. So only two people right now, which is it's not enough. But it's really been like I was surprised by how difficult it was to actually like navigate all of those things, especially just like the drug supply is very particular in every place. And so like Alex and A Hope, they're used to seeing mannitol and fentanyl, like that's their dope supply. In our dope supply, we have like eight different things and eight potential combinations of different things, and we also have high percentage fentanyl. We have like a bunch of different things that other places don't have, and so it requires a bit more attention to detail and care that other jurisdictions, not that they don't necessarily have to do that, but it's a bit more uniform. Our supply is just so volatile, and it's it's like I was when I started working in East Harlem, it wasn't uncommon to have weeks when I would show up and there'd be like many people that were dead on arrival, just at the site before the OPC would open, and so it's um, yeah, we've just been really careful about rolling it out because we don't want to put out fake information into the community that can lead to that the harm that's already kind of continuing to happen. Um, yeah, there's weird stuff. I mean, like sometimes I don't know. With the FTIR, there's certain things that pop up that look like other things that are not necessarily those things. But I mean, in Toronto, they were seeing pop rocks in their dope. Okay, so this is the way that we trained our supply. I'm sorry, I just read the word supply, and this is the way we trained our technicians. um, we have two phases. We have eligibility requirements mainly for the survey, but like if anybody shows up, we're not gonna. We don't have to do a survey for everyone. If somebody doesn't want to do a survey, it's totally fine. We'll just check it and they can leave. But the way that we do the phases is phase one is a training phase. And basically, this is the way that we, first of all, got people in the door because, like, in any other place that has drug checking in the beginning, it's hard to get people in the door because people might be skeptical. People don't want to lose their substance. And, like, it takes just time for them to meet the technician and feel that there's, like, trust there. And so what we did is we did this through an IRB, and so this is part of a research study. And we also did that because when we first started the drug checking program, we were operating in a different legal space where we actually didn't tell anyone that we were doing this. We didn't like tell the police. We didn't tell like officials. Like we just did it quietly in partnership with the syringe service programs. Um, and we didn't want any of the participants to be at risk, and so for that we sent for a certificate of confidentiality and also did it through an IRB for that added layer of protection that would protect the data ultimately, which it is an extension of protecting our participants. Whereas like if we did it without an IRB, there could be legal ramifications that we might not be ready to we don't want to expose our participants to. There are not drug-induced homicide laws in New York, although our special prosecutor loves them, and so um, and so basically the reason why this is a training phase is because participants come in, they get $25 for their time, and we ask them to leave a small amount, like half a grain of rice of their drugs, to be sent off for confirmatory testing. And that's because basically the process is, and I'll show it here, the participant will come in. IRB is institutional review board, so they just make sure that all of the research that involves people is like ethical. Like so they wouldn't approve something that they felt was unethical or whatever. So it's an added it's an added barrier because it's reviewed by a legal team, but our legal team was actually pretty chill. But it's a verbal consent and then an anonymous electronic survey. We get the drug, and then the technician that's in training will analyze the contents. And then after checking with the machine, then we'll test with fentanyl and benzodiazepine test strips. And then we'll package the small half a grain of rice sample for confirmatory testing. And then we'll read the participant what the results were that we found, with the caveat that we are in training, we could miss something could not be there, etc. And then provide counseling based on what we see. And then if there's something that is picked up from the confirmatory testing that wasn't picked up by the technician, then we'll give that information back to the participant. And the reason why we do this is because we found in the training phase, like technicians miss a lot of things, or technicians will say that there are things in the supply that there are not. And that's not okay, right? Like we should, I mean, there's like a level of that that's understandable that comes from like, yeah, there's like variation in the supply and the detection limit of the machine, but a lot of that comes from inexperience. And so in order to minimize that inexperience, we don't allow technicians to go out into the world and like act as if the things that they're finding are correct until they've reached a 90% level of concordance between the results on the FTIR and the results on the confirmatory testing. And that's their way of validating like the things that you have found are actually correct. And then once that 90% concordance has been reached, then we send just a 10 every 10th sample or so to confirmatory testing just for quality assurance. And like all that to say that like this is kind of like apprenticing. It's none of us have chemistry degrees. None of us like, we just are people who do drugs and like know a lot about drugs. And like there are people in other jurisdictions that also don't have degrees in any of this, but um it's just kind of like something like a trade school skill, but you still need to know how to use the machine appropriately for the particular context within our drug supply to responsibly put out information into the community. Um, and so that's how the flow goes. And then, like I said, the training phase continues until 90% concordance is reached. And then in phase two, then participants get the results back in real time. We don't have to wait for confirmatory tests to come back. And again, we send back every 10th sample, samples that cause serious adverse health reactions or overdose, things that we couldn't identify with like, some degree of certainty. I don't want to say certainty, but like feeling with confidence, I suppose. And then we're also working on quantification at the moment. So I do present like quantification of fentanyl, which has been really, really like one of the most helpful things that I've been able to do with the machine to be able to approximate how strong the supply is for someone if they're using fentanyl. Yeah, so we're we're kind of in this strange place right now because like there needs to be standards that are set so that we are appropriately informing the community with the machines, like the way that they're used. But there just hasn't been some unified thing put out yet, and so like we need to do that. Um, this isn't like a state or federal thing. Like the machine works the same across, no matter where you use it. And I think that the training standards should be the same. I think at the bare minimum, anyone who's considering getting a machine should set aside at least $10,000 for training. Because that I think if you get one person really well trained within your organization, you can probably have that person train everybody else. But there needs to be one person who's trained really well from people who have been doing this already. And I think the other pot of money that's really important to get is for confirmatory testing. Although NAB, if NAB is presented here before, like NAB can potentially offer other, alternatives, especially for like smaller drug user run drug users unions. Like they may be able to get like low cost or free testing. I don't think that federal or state standards will come. Just like for example, using fentanyl test strips as an example. Like fentanyl test strips were never validated for their use. Like BTNX started selling them. They're used off label for originally for the purposes of urine testing, and now we're using them in the community. And there's always been this like long back and forth of like how do we use them? Because like it feels like the instructions are constantly changing in some ways, or they vary by jurisdiction depending on like how much meth you have in the supply or what analogs you see in your supply. Yeah, and it's because there's no quality assurance because the government hasn't set standards for them, which is like lame, but like also I don't know, it's this weird balance of like the FDA should be setting standards and quality standards for something as important as fentanyl test strips so that they don't end up like causing mixed information and people misinterpreting them and potentially dying from that. But at the same time, like I don't trust the government, and so I don't know, like I don't know if they do a good job at something like that. And so like I don't think that federal or state standards will come. I think that as harm reductionists and people who care about our communities, like we should collectively say like this is a standard that we need to have so that we know that like the information that's being put out into the community is like actual good information. And I think at the bare minimum, that's like getting a machine, having about $10,000 for training, and having money for confirmatory testing, or working with some sort of confirmatory testing lab that might work with you for free. So like a partnering university, or like a lab like NABS lab. And I'll talk a bit about the technology towards the end. Um, but yeah, like, for example, I'll give another example. Like some folks in the Northwest, I won't say where, but they've made a really harsh transition from black tar heroin to M30 blues, right? And so they've gone from people injecting black tar to now smoking M30 blues, and people are smoking them several times a day because they're more short acting, and they're kind of going through that really sharp increase in overdoses that we went through in 2017. But they haven't seen powdered fentanyl. They haven't seen powdered fentanyl. It tends to be higher percentage fentanyl. And then in the past 2 weeks, they started to see it. And so it's just like the ways that you do drug checking for each of those things are very different. And if you don't know how to do it with each for each substance with each technique, like once that hits your supply, you're gonna be like, what the fuck, you know? And I think that's why the training is really important, and that's why just like being aware of what's happening around, even if it's not showing up in your own supply, is really important, because the supply shifts so quickly. Like we were talking about xylazine last year, and now it's really like it's really starting to hit us hard, and it's happened so quickly, you know. And so I think just knowing how quickly the supply changes, and how drug checking is an emerging practice. So like I'm still learning stuff now. You know, like there's a lot of things that I don't know, and the confirmatory testing has really been an important piece to be like, what is that? You know, and knowing like, okay, this thing is showing up in the supply now. I need to look out for this thing, or being aware of like this thing is under the 5% detection limit. I probably won't be able to pick it up. I need to find strips for it, or you know, those kinds of things that we have to be malleable in considering. Let me look at the chat, see if there's other stuff. So the xylazine strips, we're currently waiting on the validation for them. So like I'll be honest, they're really annoying. They're worse than fentanyl test strips. Like either like the supply is has a ton of xylazine, or they produce a lot of false positives. We're not sure yet. I'm waiting for confirmatory testing results to know. But there's a couple of vendors at this point. So like if things look dicey with these vendors, we might switch over to do, because we're just doing field validation. So it's not even like, it's more of like we're testing it out before putting it out, I guess, or before saying that they work. So if these that we're piloting out for some, they're giving the lab that we're working with is giving it to us for free. But if those don't work, then we're gonna switch over to a different brand and see if those might work better. But I think that those would be really helpful. We just don't want to put them out without accurate instructions, and also, I mean, like it would probably be better. I don't know. It's a complicated thing. You know how test strips, like you want people to use them, but if there's false positives, people will lose faith in them, and then they'll just discard them altogether. And so we just want to make sure that it's coming out in a place that it's actually helpful for folks. Yeah, so there's four of us that actively go around the country and do trainings right now, just because there's a deficit in that. Um, and between the four of us, we've kind of like covered different parts of the country. So you know, if I don't have time to do it, one of the other three folks that are running programs, that'd be cool. Yeah, would be able to support. Yeah, I'll just run through this really quick. So this is what it looks like when you're looking at the software. This was the first scan I ever did, so I have like an emotional attachment to it. It was sold as MDMA to me by my dealer, and it ended up being MDA, which I was upset about because I had a really rough come down. I was like, what the fuck? Why do I feel so bad? I dosed it at 150. Should have dosed it at 80. It's fine. You learn stuff. But if you look here, the red is the substance that was sold to me, and then the blue is the reference. So basically, we have this library that tells us all of the different substances that it could potentially be. And it's not so much that like these are the things, but just like how well does the library fit with the fingerprint that's being provided here. So this is kind of like an easy scan. Like all the peaks fit correctly. If you subtract this out, there's really no signal left. So this sample was only MDA, and when we sent it for confirmatory testing, it was only MDA as well. In this next example, this shows a sample that has more than one thing in it. So you'll see here the red is the substance that was brought in. But if you look here, if you look all the way to the right, you can just ignore that. This tends to be kind of like noise. Like the FTIR is not great at the extremes. But we're really worried about what happens more in the center. And you see here, there's like this little signal that's unaccounted for by the blue, by the blue. And so the first thing that came up that is in the sample is cocaine. So this is definitely cocaine. You see how the cocaine fits under the red well. So after that, we subtract out the signal from the first scan, and then we have the second scan. And if, as you can see, the second scan, the red and the blue match up, pretty well as well. We have phenacetin left over, and phenacetin is an analgesic medication that is banned from many countries because after post-monitoring surveillance was done with this particular painkiller, it was shown to be associated with kidney cancer and renal failure. And unfortunately, it's a pretty common cocaine cut because it kind of looks like cocaine. It has a similar stimulating and numbing effect as cocaine, and a lot of participants don't even realize that that's what's being cut into their drugs. And so I think this is just like data stuff. Like the main things is that there's hella fentanyl everywhere. We kind of knew that in the dope supply. The other thing that's of interest is that of all the substances that were sold as non-opioids, none of them have had opioids in them. Anything that I have tested that has had opioids in them has been mixed in intentionally, goofballs, speedballs, things like that. But I haven't tested anything that was not supposed to have fentanyl in it, which is interesting given. I mean, the cases that we see are real, but they're definitely not the norm. A lot of what we're seeing is people that are intentionally mixing them in, or just being sloppy. Like I have people that are like, I have Coke, and then I test it and there's dope, and I'm like, why is there dope in this Coke? And they're like, oh, that's my dope bag that I put my Coke in. It must be leftover dope. And I'm like, you could have told me that. um, this is a little bit about xylazine, which I'll leave this for questions at the end. And yeah, some case studies, but I'll pause there in case folks have questions or want to have any specific dialogue about drug supply stuff. We're going through this weird thing where there's like a ton of vendors um, for machines, and just like the fentanyl test strip distributors, like there's people that are opportunists looking to make money off of the overdose epidemic, and there's a lot of people saying that certain machines are amazing and they're do it all and you don't need training and da da da, and like I don't know what's true and what's not true because the only machine that has been used in the community for a very long time and that has a community around it is the FTIR, the Bruker FTIR. And so for that reason, like that's why we have kept to that machine. I think that if we were to consider bringing in a new machine into the community, there would have to be extensive field validation with confirmatory testing, which means you just need to have a ton of money for confirmatory testing and time to validate it. Um, which like I hope that some labs will do that, but like I know for us, like we don't have the time or money to do that right now. So for that reason, we like recommend people to get an FTIR, but like if there's leftover money and people want to consider another machine, like they could do that, but you would need to have a lot of money for confirmatory testing to like cross validate how the machine actually works.
I mean, the other thing is too, when I send this out, I'm gonna put Yarelix's email in there just in case like folks who are watching this after will be like, oh, now I have more questions because I'm sure you're not the only one. And think about it, if there are only 4 people in the entire country who are doing this shit, like think about that for a second. Like there are more questions than answers at this point. Yarelix, from like what you're saying too, it sounds like every day you're learning something new, and every day there's kind of like so my one question for you, I think, is someone doing this work in New York and trying to make sure the community is informed and providers are informed. Is there any kind of reporting or like trends or any data that gets like put out on social media or anything that we can like grab? Because I would love to just like take some of that and throw it up and be like, yo, this is what's going on. In this 3-month period, this is what we're seeing, and this is how we need to address that.
Um, I'd say like yeah, we see kind of the same trends in the city. Like in terms of the dope is has a lot of issues, but the main issues that we see is high percentage fentanyl, which like in a nutshell, different pockets of New York City have different tolerances that tend to be okay, tend to vibe with a person's body. So like in the Lower East Side, 5 to 7% is kind of like the average amount of fentanyl that I see. In East Harlem, it tends to skew a bit stronger, so it tends to be between like 8 to 10%. That tends to be more of the average. Um, and when I see people that are dropping outside of my door with overdoses like every hour, and like, having really intense experiences, is when I see between like 15 to 20% fentanyl. I don't think I've seen over 20% yet. But that's not, that's almost double what they usually use. And so it's a very fast, like, they inject, they fall out in the moment that, that they've finished injecting. And so that's been interesting to see in real time in the overdose prevention center, because we're able to actively like see someone fall out, take their drugs, test it, figure out what caused that reaction. Um, and I don't really know what to do about that. It's just it varies, like literally, like the same bag, same stamp, same color. One week it's 10%, next week it's 16, and there's nothing that we can do besides have encourage participants to check them beforehand and put out alerts within the program, so that participants are aware of what's going on. And also, like, it changes every week, every 2 weeks. Um, the other thing that's concerning that we're seeing is xylazine. So like at, this time last year, it was something like 25% of samples had between trace amounts and small amounts of xylazine. At this point, it's gone upwards of 30 to 40% in certain pockets of the city. It's definitely higher in the South Bronx than it is in the Lower East Side. And like I said, the supply tends to be very different, even across neighborhoods. And so we're really we're really excited and interested in seeing what we're going to find in Brooklyn. Um, Besides that, lots of ecstasy pills that are just meth. But it's such a small amount of meth that the person still has a good time. So it's like, it's okay. They just have to be aware of that and like take it earlier than not, so that they get some sleep if they want to get some sleep that night. Cocaine that has phenacetin, like I mentioned, also cocaine that has levamisole. And levamisole is an antiparasitic medication that lowers the immune system. And so that's not ideal during COVID, obviously, because it can make someone sick. And it's also really hard on the liver. It's also like kind of harsh when you snort. So like, cocaine, your sinuses can get dry, and it's winter, so like that's also a consideration. But your cocaine shouldn't burn when you use it. So things like that. Um, Meth tends to just be meth. I haven't seen any meth that wasn't meth. Um, and with stimulant samples, it really depends on the program. So like, I did drug checking at Housing Works PHP, and I definitely saw more meth in that area, in like the Midtown area, than in other areas. But I really, it comes in waves. Like some days I see a ton of crack, other days I see a ton of dope, other days I see a lot of benzos. Like it just depends on who shows up that day. I see a good amount of ketamine. Um, and the ketamine that I've seen tends to be just ketamine, or ketamine cut with a cut that is also used in meth called MSM. It's called dimethylsulfone, which is it's it's just a supplement. It's not anything harmful besides the fact that they're like ripping you off. Like it hurts that they're ripping you off. But it's not something that I would be like super concerned about. Um, so yeah, it's kind of like a high level summary of what we're seeing. But I'm happy to talk through like social media sharing of drug checking results, because I think it's really important, and we need to just find creative ways to do that, because yeah, people need to know.